only find that through difference. That is to say, I only became aware that I was Canadian by going somewhere else. And then coming back and realizing that those intellectual cultures, whether they were Australia or the United States or England, that I was speaking a different language, which I then had to find. And it wasn't only because we come into these situations and, you know, we're said, okay, you're speaking on behalf of Canada, you're speaking on behalf of Australia, whatever. Okay, so now you have to name your difference, but also that you do discover, to some extent, those genealogies of your own history by realizing that they're different from something else, which is also constituting them as different.
For me, the most important difference, to be truthful, is the difference between me after I went to Hong Kong and everything that came before. Like before, I relate very much to what Jodie said because as an Australian who worked and taught in the US or in Europe, I learned I was Australian and I learned things about Australia and I thought exciting things. But when a moment came historically where I couldn't bear to be in Australia because our government was so awful and I had this opportunity to go somewhere else, I just, without deliberately thinking about it, kind of unbecame that Australian intellectual. I mean, I now find it very hard to go back at all.
When you were saying before that they said, you know, about Foucault, that Foucault makes us, you know, makes us feel as if there's nothing you can do with it. So, in a way, there is a, you know, there's an expiry date on those European theorists. You know, this brings us to the question of multiple modernities, because the pedagogical situation is normally where you invite somebody into a shared language of rationality. You know, you have your vernacular languages and your parochial thoughts, but in this context we will share a universal language of rationality. Well, that used to be Euro-modernity, but when you're looking at a situation where Descartes is no longer going to be read in Shanghai or Derrida will cease to be relevant in Ottawa one day, whose modernities are going to provide the rational framework?
Just as one discovers that one's, you know, Australian by going somewhere else. For instance, students can understand that a piece of thinking has a particular language when they see another kind of language. So for instance, if I'm going to give students, I don't know, Darwin to read, I'm definitely going to give them Thomas King, who's a Canadian Indigenous writer, so that they can understand that the relation, you know, that the two of them have fundamentally different ideas to the concept of washing machines, for instance, and that their whole language is different. And it's only then that they start to understand that what they're looking at is not only the subject of what they're writing about, but also the language with which it's being brought to them. And, you know, I think it's really good actually if you can get them to read fiction and philosophy and history and so forth, because then they understand that you've got these different layers of language that are giving them different kinds of understanding, and some of them will be more comfortable with some than with others.
Okay, I'm thinking about your question. Maybe I can say a couple of things. One is, what can we suggest, not only for you, for all of us, to bring into a classroom for teaching cultural studies? One thing that I've been doing lately is to make clear from the outset that every course, undergraduate, graduate, even Economics 101, tells a story. And it's a particular story, and it has an argument. So in my course is about modernity. There's a particular argument about multiple modernities and the possibility of alternatives to modernity. So I try to make that explicit, especially at the graduate level, and it's useful to make it explicit. And then the graduate level is more difficult, and there is the question of sometimes even, and I wonder if any of you have comments on this, I wonder sometimes, especially teaching in the US, in North Carolina, where is the lead public university, where we have the privileged students from the state, mostly white students, not only white students, also African Americans, and from time to time a few Latinos and a few foreigners. That how do you bring them the bad news in a way? Especially when I teach anthropology or ecology, about the world is a mess and we are messing it up. And especially also your country, the US, has a particular role in messing it up today. And so how do you do it without, the way in which I call it, without disabling their morals, without getting them into the pessimism of the sort of easy deconstructionism that says, well, there's nothing that can be done, blah, blah, blah. And even, so sometimes, and pedagogically, how do you deal with that question? I mean, I'm lucky that students who tend to come to anthropology courses tend to be already sort of progressive and they want to change the world and so forth. But if you get, let's say, a white male Republican, how do you try to convey to this person both deconstruct his worldview, but doing it in a way in which you also give him tools to reconstruct it, to put it back together in a sense. Even he's not going to become a radical, very unlikely. I mean, from time to time they will. I remember in the 80s at UC Santa Cruz when I was there were some very famous courses, Introduction to Women's Studies and Introduction to Latino Studies. And those teachers took, because it was kind of the politics of the moment, 70s and 80s, sort of what I would call a radical approach, a brutal approach, to say, you know, our culture is completely racist, completely capitalist, completely patriarchal. There is nothing to be salvaged about this. But that created so much confusion among 18, 19-year-olds. It was, and so much self-hatred among, you know, white males and all kinds of people as well, that for me it was very disabling. I mean, some people came out of that transformed, and the courses were described as a conversion experience actually, and it engaged them very emotionally. It was very deeply. So it was something very important about those experiences.
Okay. Now, I want to give a curriculum answer. I want you to let me do that because I'm in a position where all my thinking is about practical things, totally, like administrative, managerial things. And I have a dream of a course of a Cultural Studies 101, right, for the environment I described, where we can't do everything, but I would want to have dramatic stories by fabulous scholars who can talk to 18-year-olds about why and how did the concept of culture come to matter in the modern experience, first of all, of the world that these students will be, you know, most immediately living in. So I would do China, May 4th movement, Japan, Meiji Restoration, get someone to talk about India. Doing that would, first of all, give them like vital cultural capital for the future, but would break up one of the most disabling concepts that they bring into the classroom, which is that the world can be understood by an opposition between China and the West. Not Asia and the West, China and the West. So if you take this critical denunciatory approach and you say, well, what about the North and the South? Where's Latin America? Where's Africa? They learn to pretend to learn. As Stephen Chan, my colleague, said earlier, they go, oh yes, there is more to the world than China and the West. But secretly they're going, you know, it means the English language West and China.